independence graph up. The Fed's independence from the White House isn't set in law, it's not written in stone. It's a loose collection of norms that developed over several decades that everybody sort of agreed to abide by. But Donald Trump hasn't. He's badgered and attacked the Fed Chair Jay Powell over his reluctance to lower interest rates.
We have a stupid person, frankly, at the Fed.
He's gone after the Fed for spending too much money on an expensive building renovation, and he's tried to remove a sitting Fed governor, which is something no president has tried before. Trump will have an even bigger opportunity to put his stamp on the Fed in 2026. Let me play a quick clip for you.
Everything I'm going to talk about is things the Fed's done in the past. Prospectively, monetary policy, I will not comment on, and I'm sure he's going to do the right thing, so there'll be no criticism.
Now let's fast forward to the summer.
The Fed has had big mission creep, and that's where a lot of the spending's going. That's why they're building these new or refurbishing these buildings, and I think they got to stay in their lane. And I think that based on the way they cut rates last fall, they should be cutting rates now.
Besson's been the one telling the president you really shouldn't fire the Fed chair, and yet you can see how he's changed his posture toward the Fed, increasingly telling the central bank how he thinks they should be setting interest rates. I covered the Fed for all of Trump's first 4 years, but what we've seen this year hasn't been anything like that. And I think there's a good chance that a long time from now, if we look back at how the relationship between the White House and the Fed changed, people are going to look at 2025 as that hinge point. Over the course of the year, Trump has really dialed up his attacks on Powell and the Fed. First, he was calling Powell a bunch of insults.
We have a guy that's just a stubborn mule. We have a man who's not a smart man. He's always late.
Then he went over to the Fed to make a stink about some cost overruns on the Fed's building project.
It looks like it's about $3.1 billion. It went up a little bit, or a lot.
In August, he tried to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook, something no president's done before. And in September, he was able to fill a vacancy on the Fed's board with one of his top advisors, who's still technically an employee of the Trump White House. So why is Fed independence so important? The Fed's main job is to make sure the economy doesn't get too hot or too cold. And their key tool is setting interest rates. When politicians can control the price of money, there's a temptation to sweeten things up for that next election, and that's how you get into inflation problems. In the 1970s, President Nixon famously put pressure on his Fed chair, Arthur Burns, to keep interest rates low ahead of the 1972 election.
You see, Dr. Burns, that's a standing vote of appreciation in advance for lower interest rates and more money.
And that contributed to the high inflation of the 1970s. The Federal Reserve Act has statutory protections, but they're maybe flimsier than people assume. The two main guardrails: the Fed's budget is under its own control. It doesn't have to go to Congress for an appropriation. And that's important. You can't cut off the Fed's funding if you don't like what they're doing. The second protection in the law says that Fed officials can only be removed for cause. It can't just be, I don't like what you're doing with interest rates. So 2026 will be an important year for the Fed. You can circle a couple of dates on your calendar. The first important date is in January. That's when the Supreme Court has set oral arguments for Lisa Cook, who is challenging her removal from the Fed board. If the Supreme Court rules in Cook's favor, it strengthens that removal protection. It is going to be harder now for presidents to remove any Fed governor from the board. If the Supreme Court sides with Trump, it flattens that removal protection. It now says it's much easier for a president to do something presidents simply hadn't tried to do, which is to kick governors off the board. The second important date is in the middle of May, when Powell's term as chair ends. That's Trump's biggest opportunity to put his stamp on the Fed. Well, so the press conferences started about 14 years ago because they wanted to be more transparent. Other central banks had been doing them for longer. So Bernanke did them just 4 times a year. Yellen continued that. It got to the point where people said, they only think we're going to do things when there's a meeting with a press conference. Can we do this after every meeting? And so that's what Powell started doing after a year. Are you able to turn right here? 2025 was the first act. 2026 is shaping up to be the main event. This is when Donald Trump has the chance to remake this institution if he wants to. And for investors all over the world, they're going to be watching carefully. You might not cross a bright line, you may not flip a switch, but over time, those sorts of changes we're talking about could have big ramifications for global finance. Should we think of policy risks as genuinely two-sided from here?
So I don't think that a rate hike is anybody's base.